Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to this episode of All Things Policy. My name is Shobhankita and I'm a researcher with the Technology Geopolitics team at the Takshashila Institution. For this conversation, I'm joined by Ashwin Prasad. Ashwin, it's so good to have you.
Great to be here.
Ashwin has studied satellite internet extensively. He's taught this for our GCPP technology policy webinar, as well as our space policy executive courses. So he studied this extensively, he's followed this extensively. And for this conversation, we're going to be studying and unpacking maybe one specific shift in how this technology is shaping up, particularly vis-a-vis its economics and adoption. So I think it's clear by now that the next big leap in internet connectivity is coming from satellite internet, which is, you can think of it as 5G from space. And while you may think that the typical end user of this is in a developed world, somebody maybe with less connectivity though, maybe a hiker or somebody on a yacht or somebody running a massive rural farm in Australia, New Zealand, in the US, etc. But one underappreciated and unexpected market for satellite internet is coming out from people who actually need it the most and who are also showing willingness to pay for it in ways that were previously not imagined. So think about Lagos, think about Myanmar, think about African countries, think about small towns across India, Philippines, Indonesia, all of that. Also conflict zones where we see satellite internet increasingly coming into the head with the government regulation, especially with the rise of internet shutdowns across conflict zones globally. So I think what's interesting here is that developing nations aren't just observers, they're active customers, and they're actually turning out to be the biggest customers. And this is going to change how connectivity happens, as well as how economics of this technology shapes up. So Ashwin, I wanted to first ask you, what's actually changed recently that makes this particular shift worth talking about?
So earlier this month, there was the Mobile World Congress at Barcelona. This is an annual event that covers, it is the flagship event for mobile communications technologies around the world. And at the MWC this year, Starlink made a presentation and they unveiled their new Starlink mobile branding and technology. They used to call this direct to cell, but now they're calling it Starlink Mobile. And the bottom line is that previously Starlink satellites needed a terminal to operate with its users. So a user had to have a terminal, he would turn on this terminal, the satellite would communicate with that terminal, and the terminal would give the user Wi-Fi, and they could use it just like any other internet with all the devices that they already have. So clearly you see this small gap where the hardware that users have on their own already cannot directly work with the satellite. So they need this middleman of a device that gives them that connectivity and gives them Wi-Fi. And that's a business problem they wanted to solve because these terminals are costly, they add some friction to the process and all that. So now the next leap is this idea of direct to cell, where satellites, which are much larger, they're as large as a Boeing 737, to give you some context, will have a much larger antenna, and they're going to directly beam internet and network to your mobile. So it's like a cell tower, but from space. So there's no special hardware, there is no terminal, just your regular phone connecting to a satellite like it would connect to a cell tower. And so this is going to rapidly and instantly expand their customer base from those who are willing to spend a few hundreds or even $1,000 on a terminal to anyone with a smartphone, which is going to be very disruptive. And like considering that they have 10 million active users already, they expect that it's going to reach 25 million this year, and that's more than double. And I think they attribute a lot of it to this technology. So this is going to change adoption, use, and the entire user base of a technology like like Starlink. And considering what is already happening with Starlink, which is kind of unexpected in the developing world, I thought this would make for a interesting conversation, given that that trend is only going to increase from now.
Right. No, so I think that's quite interesting that the cost of the technology now can be like it's pretty much crashed, right? With
Yeah.
almost no hardware upfront costs involved. And how do you see the demand for this technology then shaping up in terms of the target customers, the ones with the ability to pay, and where these are immediately showing interest?
So the assumption was that this technology, given its high entry barriers, is going to predominantly be used in the developed countries for the edge cases, right? Like the people, great examples that you outlined. Somebody in a remote area, somebody without a terrestrial infrastructure, living far away, someone on the move. But this is going to, actually shape outcomes in the developing world, because the demand there is actually the real bigger slice of the demand for internet around the world. And the parallel to this is how, when a country has been slow to adopt a technology, and they're so slow that a newer technology just like enters the world, they can leapfrog, and they don't have to like even go through the older path of adopting all the different stages of that technology. For instance, in the 2000s, large parts of South Asia and Africa skip landline telephones entirely. I mean, you can see this happening even among your own contacts in India, that many people simply stopped having a mobile, like landline phone. Even ones that did not have a landline phone simply did not get a landline, and instead just bought a smartphone like an iPhone. The reason was that the copper wire networks that the countries and the governments and like the basic infrastructure companies had to invest and build across the country never happened, because like they had other priorities, and eventually by the time it had to be done, there was a newer technology that would completely replace the old one. On the other hand, countries in Europe and America spent a lot of decades laying down copper wire networks, a lot like railway lines across their whole country to for the connectivity. And you also see India with UPI bypassing card usage. China has also done this. So all of this is just like leapfrogging technologies where, in this case, instead of building terrestrial infrastructure like fiber optic cables, 5G towers, backhaul networks, and all that, countries with challenging terrains or sparse populations in certain regions or low population density in certain regions, that includes India as well, especially in the rural parts, can like just use Starlink, and it will actually fill the gap very fast. And so it's a very compelling motive even for the countries and the governments and the people to adopt it. And I'll give you some numbers. So in Africa, 400 million people still do not have internet access. In terms of percentage, take Sudan, it has internet like usage of 12%. So 88% of the population is not using internet. Myanmar, with like it has been undergoing a lot of strife and conflict. Even there, only around 28% of the population has no access to internet at all. There's a lot of shutdowns and all of that is happening. So they are all untapped markets from these satellite internet companies' perspective. And another example is Nigeria. I was reading about how Starlink was launched there in 2023, and Starlink has made a intentional effort to launch in these countries before, right? And when they launched in 2023, like now, I think 2 years down the line, 2 to 3 years down the line, they have become the second largest internet service provider there. So same thing with Zimbabwe. They have captured around a quarter of the internet market within months of launching. It's been like a year or so, and there is like the increase in subscriptions trends are all in like 500%, 300%. It's along these lines. And all of these is happening in specific urban centers there, so it's obviously not egalitarian, but like centers like urban centers like Nairobi or Lagos or Lusaka, they have seen explosive demand for Starlink. So just as of last year, they are operating in more than like around 2 dozen African countries. And in most of these countries, because of the infrastructure like difficult infrastructure status and other issues, a monthly Starlink subscription is actually cheaper than a local internet provider. In Ghana, I think it's about half the price. In Sudan itself, even though this is still costly for these countries, given their income levels, they are finding they're being very smart in the way they use it. I think there's a cafe model in Sudan where a person buys a Starlink terminal and he sets up sort of a cafe, and users come and use it on an hourly basis whenever they need internet. So that those market mechanisms are already happening to subsidize the cost and make internet access more accessible to everybody. But I have to highlight that the numbers aren't crazy, right? It is, I mean, though the percentages are, it is still around 60,000 people in Nigeria. Kenya has around 20,000. So considering that Starlink has 10 million people, this is not that these are the defining revenue making places for Starlink, but it's only going to grow, and the untapped potential is there. So I think, yeah, it's going to continue being a predominant player in these places.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think at least while you were speaking all this, in my mind, I was thinking back about just the potential for technology to leapfrog how people live. So, from an emerging market perspective, there are, of course, a lot of infrastructure gaps, and technology that may have started elsewhere or been innovated elsewhere just have so much more applications and capability to leapfrog productivity, so on, in the developing world, especially because the state has challenges with, infrastructure bottlenecks. And I was thinking about the kind of opportunities this means for entrepreneurs and business people, right? Like, for example, when Google Maps and smartphones were a thing in the early 2010s, it was only a matter of time before, the likes of e-commerce and the likes of quick delivery, were immediately possible. So Uber was essentially a product of Google Maps and smartphones. Similarly, in India, once the infrastructure was laid through the early blocks of digital public infrastructure, with Aadhaar and eKYC and so on, it was a matter of time before fintech companies could come and innovate a whole bunch of products over it, in payments and insurance, so on and so forth. So, of course, this is the good in the sense that you're able to leapfrog just state capacity challenges, telecom infrastructure challenges, just with the help of technology that's grown and has reduced costs and entry barriers for everybody. But the other aspect of the same, and from a policy perspective, is that specifically in conflict regions, you can't really control access to these technologies, and it's always going to be easier to get access to the internet and mobilize people against a regime or the government of the day, right? And I think from the government's perspective, in conflict zones, this can be one concern. The other can also be in border areas where, how do you then, if you're beaming internet from space, how do you then respect sovereign borders between two nation states? I think that might be the issues vis-a-vis conflict zones, border zones, etc. How do you look at this?
Yeah, this is a part of this technology story that is very compelling, because you realize technology is very neutral and is going to facilitate use in ways both um, good and bad, give from different points of view. I mean, you might think a certain section of the world using it is bad, but another section might think it is good. And that is exactly what happens with these conflict zones, because in conflicts, one of the main domains that anyone in power or trying to seek power tries to control is the communication channels. And the playbook has always been internet shutdowns or communication shutdowns. You basically coerce whoever has the military power or the mandate coerces the telecom providers to stop all services, and then they can control the news that gets out and all of that. But this is the kind of thing that has gotten completely disrupted by Starlink and satellite internet in general. A few examples, I think Sudan, Myanmar, and Iran make for good case studies with this. In Sudan, there is still a civil war going on. It's been devastating uh, uh, for over 2 years now, and there is the armed forces and the rapid support forces, I think, on the two sides of this conflict. And in 2024, the one of these forces intentionally targeted telecom infrastructure in cities like Khartoum and knocked out connectivity for large swaths of the population. I think more than 30 million people lost connectivity, and such blackouts went on for years there in some of these places. And this vacuum was perfect for Starlink. And slightly funny, I find this funny, but it also goes to show how difficult it is to control these technologies, is that it's not even licensed in Sudan. Starlink is not even legal in Sudan. But then still, like, people in Sudan found ways to smuggle terminals through Libya, through South Sudan, Eritrea, and other like neighboring countries. And Starlink became the primary internet connection in all these cities, Khartoum, Al Jazeera, and all that. And even in some ways, it also became a weapon, because RSF, the very body that had attacked telecom, actually mounted Starlink terminals on their pickup trucks, and they coordinated all their military operations using Starlink. Like, drones were run using Starlink and all that. Then the army proceeded to ban Starlink, and they have confiscated a lot of terminals, but it is still not easy for them to control and identify who's using Starlink where. Right? It actually like shapes real military outcomes this way. Myanmar has also been the same. There has been a military coup there, and the junta has shut down mobile networks, and there has been widespread internet shutdowns. I think one of the most internet shutdown country in the recent years. And they have also blocked VPNs and all that. And using them is a criminal offense. But that has still not deterred some people and other factions from using Starlink, though it is again not legally available in Myanmar. There are more than 3,000 apparently, 3,000 terminals operating there, smuggled in from countries like Thailand. Um, and they're also being used to do a lot of good, like field hospitals use them, humanitarian groups have been coordinating their relief efforts using them. So they have been used both for military and non-military purposes. Iran is one of the more evolved stories here, because there was a real effort to control Starlink when Starlink became available first in 2022, and it was officially allowed by the US government to bypass like sanctions and provide these services in these countries. Like, a lot of terminals are already in use, like thousands of them. And the Iranian parliament has responded by criminalizing it, but the units have apparently kept growing, if you believe the reports. And then recently, in the 2026 shutdown, it's probably the most severe shutdown Iran has seen. And Starlink obviously again became one of the few remaining uh, services that people had to continue using the internet. And it was used to coordinate protests, like propagate videos of protests and other messages. And I think even Starlink even subsidized the use in Iran, obviously egged on by the US government. And Iran actually tried to block the internet. And this is something even Russia has tried to block Starlink in the Ukraine regions in the war. But Iran tried, and to an extent succeeded, because they were using like GPS jammers to control, like, to disrupt the signals, and Starlink terminals need GPS to operate. And so that degraded the signal a lot. And then there was this whole technological battle between Starlink and Iran in trying to overcome these limitations. But you see that that this is actively shaping civilian and military outcomes around the world. And I think this is going to continue being the case. And the countries will continue trying to in some way block Starlink while Starlink continues to. I think they've already figured out a way to transmit their location data through the signal itself, even if GPS is blocked. So this cycle is going to continue, and conflict zones are going to continue seeing satellite internet as a technology in use. Yeah.
But I have to step back further and ask you the original question, right? That it seems like the initial customer was thought to be in the developed world, and increasingly we see that that narrative is not fully true, and there are obviously Starlink customers globally. But wouldn't the bigger market, or maybe the largest market for this, still be in the developed world in terms of the ability to pay? And isn't that where the money is? So what are the trade-offs necessarily vis-a-vis the developed and the developing world in terms of adoption of this technology?
Yeah, I think in the developing world, it's the people with the largest marginal benefit willing to go through the high marginal cost of acquiring Starlink because they are really compelled to use internet, despite it being unavailable due to infrastructure issues or conflict, or simply because they are yeah, far away from urban centers of sorts. But that ultimately happens a lot more in developed countries, and that's it makes sense also, right, that the digitalization would have been greater, and therefore internet users are also greater. And yeah, like I think until 2023, more than 50% of all Starlink users were just American. That has shifted now. The majority still is now outside the US, but that goes to show that still adoption and diffusion of this tech is the most in developed countries. Even now, I think 2 million of the, like last year, of 2 million of the 8 million or so customers back then were again the US, so a quarter at least. So the economics of this technology favors wealthy countries because the terminal, and at least before the smartphone revolution and this Starlink mobile announcement, the terminals were still expensive. It costed around $300, and the subscription itself was of more than $100. So that all of this is expensive and not affordable for like countries that don't have dollar for a currency and have lower income rates. But so yeah, and it is honestly not an affordable technology. It cannot compete with terrestrial networks in an urban setting with a dense population and a mature terrestrial ecosystem the way it is in India. In Bangalore, for instance, you have so many providers: Vodafone, Airtel, Jio, and even when Starlink comes to India, it will never be competitive with these providers for this internet. So obviously, this is going to be only in the edge cases where internet is simply not available and the cost of not having internet is too high, where you'll see users. And like alongside this, the terrestrial networks are not going to stand still. They're going to react to this. They're going to move. Starlink Mobile has just announced. Obviously, we're going to see counter moves by all these terrestrial networks, and they're also going to make their own product more appealing in other ways. And ultimately, these terrestrial networks have the speed and the bandwidth advantage because they can move massive amounts of data the way satellite internet never can. So yeah, I still think majority of the revenue and user base is still in the developed world simply because of the exorbitant costs. But it's a lot like, I see it as a lot like smartphones. Initially, smartphones were, I mean, mobile phones itself, like wireless mobile phones were a rich man's device. Not everyone had them. It was considered a luxury product, but they eventually became mainstream enough because the habits changed, the economy changed, and the user preferences also changed. Now, owning a smartphone is something nearly universal. So I think that will happen with satellite internet as well, to an extent.
Uh, just a slight deviation. The fact that something like a Starlink is a US-based company, and also pretty much has a monopoly in the lower Earth orbit, right? Where do we see, given this massive marginal benefit for developing countries from the adoption of this technology, and of course, maybe there is incentive for Starlink to cater to this demand as well, but just the monopoly and the US only domination here, how do you see that panning out for developing countries? Is that something to worry about, or how do you look at this?
I think from a position of space strategy and space technology competition, it is very concerning because the scale at which this technology is operating in, they have over 12,000 satellites. They are truly global, and they're able to um, corner a lot of resources in space for themselves. Be it the space they occupy in the orbit, be it the frequency resources they use, the spectrum resources they use in making all of this possible. It is very concerning, and that is something that India should be deeply worried about. Not just India, but any other aspirational space power and other powers that like non-US space powers that are trying to also have a credible space program for themselves. This is going to be a case of massive resource crunch for anyone trying to do anything in the lower Earth orbit. So in that way, it is deeply worrying. In terms of Starlink itself as a technology, a commercial civilian technology that can be or cannot be used, the access being controlled and how it is being used by the technology provider, in this case SpaceX, against India or in favor of India, I am less worried because the way I see this technology growing, it will be these developing countries that will shape how it evolves ultimately. Developed countries still will use it, but it will be the developing countries that will become the major customer base, and they will actively shape its evolution. And Starlink will know that. So there will be that conflict, even if the US government wants SpaceX to you know uh, view its own evolution in a certain way. Those that will be curtailed by the market cues that Starlink will get from countries like India and other countries in South Asia and Africa, that they will have to cater to, simply because they cannot ignore the commercial value that these countries generate. So India's huge customer base and that user power itself is a leverage point that we will, intentionally or unintentionally use in the satellite internet story. And I think we're already doing that. You see Starlink being so eager to get into India. They are jumping through all the regulatory hoops and trying to become operational here as soon as possible. So yeah.
Yeah. And I think this is also in the interest of the Digital India mission and so on, right? Because there are different kind of programs that the government is running to improve rural infrastructure access. In my peripheral research early this year, I learned that they were trying different kinds of programs where they wanted to have community hotspot centers. So if you own a small kirana store in a relatively unconnected or a low connectivity area, then you're incentivized by the government to also act as a community hotspot center, with some kind of a business entrepreneurship model. And there are also incentives for larger telecom infrastructure players to come and lay the fiber optic networks and also get subsidized for it and so on, because connectivity can mean so much more leapfrogging in the digital era. And that's the first layer, right? So it looks like you're right in terms of the internet connectivity and the Indian government. There seems to be a lot of alignment there as well. My final question to you, Ashwin, particularly about what kind of metrics or signals should we be watching to make sure that the shift in terms of the developed world of adoption and economics of this technology, the fact that it's really changing, what might be the signals that tell us that?
I think it is in the near term, in the next few years, developed countries will continue being the biggest revenue generators there for Starlink. So Australia, Canada, parts of Europe, Australia, they will still pay the highest prices, generate the most profit. So that is going to continue. And we're not going to see any other signals per se. But in the medium to long term, maybe next 10 years, then we're going to see some things changing. Things like the numbers will be overwhelmingly in the developed regions. And people without reliable internet access will start adopting this technology more and more. And you will see this because SpaceX will probably themselves go on a relentless cost curve, and they are already doing that. It's already in the pipeline. They are trying to make bigger reusable rockets so that they can drive down launch costs and overall the operational costs of the Starlink technology so that they can address these markets and compete with the cheaper options that these countries already have in terms of terrestrial networks. So that is one signal to watch out for. And the other is the way this Starlink mobile thing evolves. If it starts to work on standard smartphone hardware, which is apparently already they're doing it with Qualcomm, they're building some chips and all that. But if they start to do that more dedicatedly, then that's another sign that it's going to become even more mainstream than it already is. And lastly, like outcomes across rural areas or internet starved regions of the world, or how disaster relief protocols are changing using satellite internet and Starlink in the coming years will also tell us how it's going to be imaginatively used in a lot of this. And all of this will also be driven by a geopolitical race between US companies themselves, like Amazon's Project Kuiper, which they've renamed as Leo, how it will try to offer its services, how China, with its own constellations, which are still being built, but once it's built and operational and commercially available, how they will position it will tell us a lot about where the competition lies. India has ambitions of its own, but nothing has materialized yet. But yeah, as these constellations proliferate, competition will intensify, and it will be a very fun story to follow.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Ashwin. I know you'll be watching all of these signals and tracking developments in the months to come, and we'll look to you for further thought leadership and insights on how this shapes up. Thank you for the work you do, and thank you for this conversation.
Thank you, Shobhankita. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle at Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.